When people hear the word addiction, they usually think about substances. You got hard drugs, alcohol, pills. That's usually where people's minds go. But addiction is actually something broader than that. The way I frame it is pretty simple. Addiction is an escape from life. And look, before you click off thinking this doesn't apply to you, hear me out for a second. At the beginning of 2023, I moved across the country to California because my life was completely in the gutter from addiction. I was a full-blown addict and honestly in the worst mental state I'd ever been in. Today I've got over 3 years sober, and I actually work with addicts and people struggling with mental health. I've ran groups and counseling sessions with people who are trying to rebuild their lives. So this isn't something I'm speaking about from the outside. I've lived it, and now I see it every day. And in this video, I want to explain something that took me years to understand. Why does addiction trap people in the first place? And what actually helps someone escape that trap? Because if you're struggling with addiction right now, whether it's substances or the modern dopamine traps like scrolling or constant stimulation, there's actually a pattern behind it that most people never notice. And later in this video, I'm going to show you the exact cycle that kept me trapped for years. Because once you see it, it's hard to ignore it in your own life. And once you understand that pattern, things will start to make a lot more sense. And look, I know some people might hear the word addiction and immediately think, well, that's not me. Maybe you've never touched drugs. Maybe alcohol has never been a problem for you. But it would be silly to think that addiction only shows up in those forms. Modern life has its own versions of it. Scrolling endlessly, adult content, gaming for hours on end, constant stimulation. And I'm not saying these things are identical to something like fent or pills, because obviously they're not. But they tap into the same basic mechanism, which is escape. Because at the core of it, addiction isn't really about the substance. It's about the relationship you develop with escape. And over time, that escape slowly erodes something that's really hard to rebuild once it's gone, which is your self-respect. And once your self-respect starts eroding, everything else in your life usually follows. Your discipline, your standards, your expectations for yourself, it all drops. For me, that process started pretty young. I started smoking when I was around 12, 13 years old. By 14, it was something I was doing regularly. And by the time I turned 15, I had tried basically everything besides the stuff you see on Breaking Bad. I was hanging out with the wrong people. I had already been arrested at that point. I was making bad decisions, and it just became normal. That was the environment I was in. Now, I know what you're thinking. And I'm not saying that story is identical to everyone else's. Some people don't start that early. Some people start much later in life. Some people have really bad habits that don't involve substances. But the pattern tends to be similar. At first, it doesn't feel like your life is falling apart. It actually feels like relief. It feels like you found something that helps you deal with the things that you don't want to deal with. That's the part people misunderstand. Addiction rarely begins as destruction. It usually begins as relief. For me, it helped me escape my insecurities. It helped me escape my upbringing. It helped me escape the things that I didn't want to think about. But over time, that relief turns into dependency, and your life slowly starts shrinking around the addiction. And another part people don't talk about enough is what addiction does to the people around you. Because it doesn't just hurt you, it hurts your family, your friends, the people who care about you. And the hard part is you usually don't fully realize that while you're in it. You lie to people, break their trust, disappear from their lives. You become someone they don't recognize anymore. And look, I'm not saying people struggling with addiction are bad people. That would be hypocritical of me. Most of the time, they're just people who are hurting and trying to escape. But the reality is, addiction creates collateral damage. And that's where escape quietly turns into a prison. What started as something that you do occasionally slowly becomes something your entire life revolves around. I was on and off with substances for years, but in 2019, I got back on pills, and from that point until I came out to California, it was basically nonstop. I actually got help a few times during that period, but it never really stuck. The truth is, my life was complete chaos. What changed everything was about a week before I moved to California, I overdosed. And the thing about overdoses is they don't usually happen in some like dramatic movie moment. Most of the time it's just another day in the same routine. I remember sitting at my desk in my room watching YouTube, getting ready to use, and I was alone, and the next thing I know, I wake up on the floor and there's paramedics standing around me. The only reason I'm even alive right now is because my brother came upstairs to say goodbye before heading back to his apartment. If he hadn't walked into my room at that exact moment, I probably wouldn't be here. That's one of those moments where you realize how thin the line really is between still being here and not being here. It didn't really hit me until the next day what had actually happened. I remember waking up and just feeling completely destroyed mentally. Not just because I overdosed, but because I knew exactly where my life was headed. And look, I think a lot of people who struggle with addiction reach a moment like that where they start realizing the trajectory they're on. For me, the thought was pretty extreme but pretty simple. I'm either going to die or I'm going to end up in prison. Those were the two directions my life was moving. And once you see that trajectory clearly, it's really hard to pretend everything is fine anymore. And this is the part that people who haven't been through addiction sometimes struggle to understand. From the outside, it looks very obvious. It looks like someone is destroying their life and just refusing to stop. And yeah, that's kind of what it is. But when you're inside that cycle, it doesn't feel that simple. And look, I know some of you watching might be thinking, yeah, but I'm not doing pills or overdosing, and that's fair. But the reason I'm telling this story isn't because I think everyone watching is dealing with addiction on the same level that I was. It's because the underlying mechanism is the same. The escape, the cycle, the broken promises to yourself. You might not be waking up to paramedics on the floor, but if you're staying up until 3 a.m. scrolling every night, if you're numbing yourself with content, if you're avoiding the things that you know you should be doing, that pattern is still there. It's just a different intensity, but it's the same mechanism. And I stand on that firmly. For me, the cycle was always the same. I would use, and then afterwards I would sit there in regret and shame. I would promise myself I was done. I would say this was the last time. And then the next day, I would repeat it again. Use, regret, promise to quit, repeat. Over and over and over again. And every time that cycle repeats, it becomes just a little bit easier to believe that you were stuck forever. Eventually, I started believing something was actually wrong with me. I thought maybe I was just broken because I genuinely wanted to stop, but I couldn't. And the lie that keeps addiction alive is the same one every single time. Just one more time and then you'll stop. But it's never one more time. It's always the beginning of the same cycle all over again. When I came to California, I didn't have some huge plan for my life. I actually thought I would just have a career in music out here, which we talked about in my last video, so go check it out if you haven't yet. But I wasn't suddenly this super motivated person who had everything figured out. But I was hopeful, because for the first time, I had removed myself from the environment that was feeding the addiction. And that matters more than people think. Environment shapes behavior more than motivation ever will. I went into treatment, and for the first time in years, my life had structure again. I was eating 3 meals a day. I was going to workout classes, sitting in groups and actually talking to people again and talking about my feelings. And after about a week of detoxing, something weird started happening. My brain started coming back online because it had been offline for a while. I could actually think clearly again. It's hard to explain unless you've been through it, but it feels like I was getting my mind back. And let me be clear, getting sober doesn't suddenly turn your life into this perfect inspirational story. In fact, a lot of the early days are actually pretty boring. Because when you remove the addiction, you also remove the thing that used to fill every empty moment. Suddenly you're just left with yourself, your thoughts, your emotions, your problems. And that's uncomfortable. But that discomfort is actually where rebuilding starts. And 3 years later, I have a stable life. I have a good trajectory. I understand myself more than ever. But most importantly, I have freedom and independence. I'm not stuck in that trap anymore. And the truth is this, growth almost always happens in the places that we used to avoid. Because addiction trains you to break promises to yourself. You say you'll stop tomorrow. You say this is the last time. Eventually, you're going to stop trusting yourself. And when you stop trusting yourself, you stop respecting yourself. That's why addiction is so destructive. Not just physically, but internally. Now, here's the part a lot of people don't like hearing. You are not broken, but you do have responsibility. And look, I know that might sound harsh depending on where you're at right now. Maybe you're in the middle of the struggle and things feel completely out of control. Or maybe you've been suffering in silence. I've been there. But the reality is, nobody is coming to save you. Nobody came to save me. Nobody comes to save the people I work with either. Change starts when you start being honest with yourself. And for a lot of people, that honesty is the hardest step. It was one of the hardest for me. But honesty is usually the moment where change actually begins. Being honest about what's actually happening in your life. Honest about the things that you're doing to escape. Honest about the fact that something has to change. And the opposite of addiction isn't just sobriety or connection. The opposite of addiction is building a life you don't feel the need to escape from. Because at the beginning of this video, I said addiction is an escape from life. And the real solution isn't just removing the escape, it's building a life you actually want to stay present in. A life with structure, purpose, people around you who support the person you're trying to become. That's what I've been building over the last few years, and I'm still building it. And the truth is, rebuilding a life is a lot slower than destroying one, but it's worth it. And there's a lot more detail I can go into about this, but we'd be here for a whole hour if I explained every framework and solution that went into this process. The truth is, everyone's journey is different. Some of you watching this probably don't need treatment. I understand that not everyone watching needs to reinvent themselves like I did. That's why I only mentioned 3 things, which is honesty, addressing what you've been avoiding, and realizing that you're not alone. Because those 3 things are universal and nothing is going to work without them. If y'all want a video breaking down every solution and framework that worked for me and many others, let me know in the comments. So if you're watching this and you're somewhere in that struggle right now, whether it's substances or just some other habit that's slowly taking control of your life, just know this: you are not alone, you are not broken, but something does have to change, and that change usually starts with honesty. And if you're comfortable sharing, I'd actually like to hear where you're at right now. Not some polished story, just honestly where you're at in the process, because a lot more people are dealing with this than we talk about. And sometimes the first step towards getting out of this is realizing that you're not the only one fighting it. So if that resonates with you, consider liking and subscribing. We are building a community of people here who share like-minded goals. I'm documenting everything on this channel: the career pivot I'm doing, the wins, the losses, everything in between, and my sobriety journey. If that sounds like something you want to be a part of, feel free to join us. And as always, if you made it this far, I appreciate you. Peace out.